Well, welcome everyone. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting this evening as the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. My name's Professor Ian Hall. I'm the Acting Director of the Griffith Asia Institute, and it's my pleasure to introduce this Perspectives Asia this evening. As many of you might know, Perspectives Asia is a program of public seminars that we've been running for some time now, and very successfully, I think, that are promoted and designed by the Griffith Asia Institute in conjunction with the Queensland Gallery of Modern Art. We explore issues of contemporary culture, politics and society in our region and try to foster public discussion of Australia's relations with this very broad, very diverse and very dynamic region. It's an absolute pleasure for me to introduce our speaker for this evening. Siobhan Heanue, I suspect will be familiar to many of you in this room, a former foreign correspondent for the ABC. She was based in South Asia, reporting from countries including India, Pakistan, Afghanistan and Nepal. Siobhan has also reported from Iraq in the lead up to the Battle of Mosul in 2016. She's been embedded with the Australian Defence Force, with the US military and also with the Pakistani military, and has covered terrorist attacks and humanitarian crises in East Africa. She was a fellow with the World Press Institute in the United States in 2011, and Siobhan began her career with the ABC as a cadet in the Canberra newsroom in 2016, and she currently works as a video journalist in Townsville, of course in wonderful rainy Queensland. So today she's going to be talking about a really important topic and reflecting upon her experiences as a journalist in Australia, but also, of course, as a foreign correspondent in South Asia and elsewhere. And the topic of today's talk, as you can see from the slides up here, is the pen and the sword, fighting and talking in an age of strategic competition and curtailed press freedom. Siobhan, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Ian. And I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet this evening. Tonight, we're going to speak about war and politics and the media and the rise of China, so nothing controversial at all. But I'd firstly like to just say how excited and thrilled I am to be taking the stage at Goma. This place is my spiritual home. I come here, I was raised in Brisbane, and this place has been my temple, my church for a long time. So I'd come back from stressful deployments overseas and come here to see the artwork. I've been to every Asia Pacific triennial for the last 20 years. The first one I went to when I was a high school student and a wannabe foreign correspondent and a bit of a history nerd. And my mind was always set aflutter by the variety of perspectives, the political and historical undertow of a lot of the artwork that has been shown here over the years. So I really have to say that this place did inform my career in a roundabout kind of way, and it certainly motivated me to stay engaged with Asia, which is what I did and where I ended up working. So my foreign correspondence career started very much by accident. I'd always dreamed of being a foreign correspondent, but I never expected to be thrown into the job like I was when I was in Nepal in 2015 when the country was hit by a massive 7.9 magnitude earthquake that killed 9,000 people. Definitely a baptism of fire. This is one of the first photos I took when I emerged from under a table I was hiding under. And one of the interesting moments that I had in the few days after that earthquake was when I observed the first rescue teams to arrive. They were all from India and China. And they both made a really strong showing of their presence, their branding, you could say, everywhere that they were helping. Influence and the competition to influence. It was a pattern that I would then see time and time again as I covered South Asia over the next few years. I was based in Delhi, but the presence of Chinese influence was everywhere I looked in the patch I covered. Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, Pakistan, obviously, the Maldives and Bangladesh. And what I want to talk about tonight is that intersection between influence and the media in an age of strategic competition. That is how the press and other channels of information are used and abused domestically and regionally in the Indo-Pacific to assert and undermine influence amid great power competition. And how a strong, free press is the best defence against malign influence. The media is very much on the battlefield when it comes to great power competition. It's both a target and a weapon, long before the first salvos are fired in any actual conflict. So first, a brief look at the state of the media in our region. India, we all know, is the world's largest democracy and one of its most vibrant. The national elections that I covered there were a riot of colour and passion. This is canvassing the opinions of some locals in the Varanasi tea shops the day before the election. And at BJP party headquarters in Delhi, the day that Modi was returned to power. Now, the Indian press is a thing to behold. It's raucous and it's diverse. And while the industry seems alive and well, and it is, there is a deeper, darker story. Journalists are often subjected to vexatious lawsuits and charges of sedition or terrorism. The sedition laws date back to the colonial era and they can carry a sentence of life in jail. Just to give one example, a Muslim journalist, Siddiqui Kapan, was charged with sedition when he went to the state of Uttar Pradesh to report on the brutal rape and murder of a young Dalit woman there. He's been languishing in jail since 2020, so there may never be a conviction, but kind of the torturous, glacial pace of the Indian justice system is punishment enough, and also it really kind of deters people from reporting on controversial stories. So there have been around 60 criminal charges against journalists nationwide in India just last year. Some of those were journalists who were charged because when they reported on violent protests in Delhi, they reported that one protester was shot by police. They were arrested for reporting that story, and other people, including a prominent opposition MP, were charged with the same simply for retweeting that story. Government internet shutdowns have been used to completely curtail the sharing of information and reporting in Jammu and Kashmir under the guise of preventing violence, and foreign journalists are not allowed to go there at all. For me, one of the most telling things is that in 8 years in power, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the leader of the biggest democracy in the world, has never held a single press conference. He's referred to journalists as prostitutes publicly. It's not really the kind of thing you expect in a democracy, right? The ruling BJP party has tried to strong-arm Twitter into silencing critics, demanding the removal of thousands of tweets that are critical of its policies, but it also exploits social media with misinformation campaigns and by trolling journalists. The BJP troll farms are renowned for the vitriol that they can heap on in vast quantities on journalists, particularly female journalists and Muslim journalists working in India. I experienced it myself when I was reporting in a brief clash between India and Pakistan in Kashmir in 2019. There were airstrikes across the border after Indian soldiers were killed in a terrorist attack. And after simply tweeting facts, no opinion, no analysis, like the fact that an Indian aircraft had been shot down and the pilot captured, I was inundated with direct messages threatening all kinds of sexual violence and death. Interestingly, that experience of reporting on the Kashmir conflict showed a huge divide between how the Pakistanis and the Indians dealt with the press. The Indians really stonewalled any journalists from going to the location of these clashes. There were many reports of locally employed producers working for foreign journalists being harassed, denied entry to press conferences, that kind of thing. And yet the Pakistanis invited a group of us representing international media outlets, the New York Times, Washington Post, The Economist and good old ABC. We were all invited to go under military escort to the sites of the airstrikes, and that's one photograph there. And it was just very interesting to see how open they were. And of course they had their own ulterior motives. They brought us into the headquarters of the military public relations kind of building, I suppose, and this was the cup that our chai was served in during meetings. I think the message was a little bit more intimidating than they intended it to be. But they did open the kimono and let us in. And of course, you know, they used that visit to kind of demonstrate on the global stage that they were open and transparent and, you know, welcoming of the foreign press to interrogate what had happened. And that's us heading up to the site of the airstrikes on the back of an army jeep with some local media. It was just a very interesting contrast, and it worked in their favour because you know, we interviewed Imran Khan, we had an off-the-record session with the Chief of the Defence Force, and, you know, while we questioned critically, as Western journalists want to do, it certainly gave them, I guess, the running edge in telling that story to a global audience. And it was a very tentative situation for a while, as happens when two nuclear powers exchange munitions. Now, of course, the harassment is much more direct in other places than South Asia. In the latest Press Freedom Index, which is a press freedom watchdog, Bangladesh rated a poor 151 out of 180 countries ranked, Pakistan 145. So journalists do risk death and detention in these places. India is ranked 142 out of 180, and all the South Asian nations have dropped in the rankings in recent years. And let's not forget Afghanistan, because I think we'd be naive to believe the campaign for influence between great powers is over there, even though it's all been swept from the headlines here. It's always been an incredibly dangerous place to be a journalist, particularly for local journalists. And it's estimated, this is obviously, this is during the Eid ceasefire between the ANA and the Taliban, and the last time the ABC went in there before it all fell to pieces. So half the media outlets in that country have basically been shuttered since the Taliban took over last year, and half of all media workers have fled the country, and that's an astonishing loss, given that the establishment of a diverse and independent media in Afghanistan was one of the very few success stories to come out of the last 20 years. I speak regularly to exiled Afghan journalists, and their sense of just loss and grief is quite profound. So what? The picture is dire for media in the region, with internal and external threats to media freedom in countries with an established press and in those where the Fourth Estate rests on more wobbly foundations. Combine that with changing business models and the press is getting pinched in all directions. But what does this have to do with geopolitics, and why should we care? How does a weak media culture or a regime putting pressure on journalists impact the bigger picture? In Australia, we have a tradition of media freedom that we largely view as a good thing in and of itself, and an important ingredient in liberal democracy, but it's also a strategic asset. In a 2013 speech, Xi Jinping spoke of the need to tell China's story well, disseminate China's voice well, and strengthen China's discourse power internationally. China has established state broadcasting outfits in Sri Lanka and Fiji and further afield, and that was around about the same timeline that saw the ABC's Australia network pulled out of the Asia-Pacific region, and the ABC was replaced by Chinese state media almost immediately when we gave up certain shortwave radio frequencies. But far more effectively, China shares its content with local broadcasters, upgrades their studios, and it sends local journalists to China for professional training which is organised by its Foreign Affairs Information Department. The US has recently responded by investing $300 million in supporting free press institutions and the establishment of government bodies to counter Chinese propaganda under its Strategic Competition Act, which was passed last year. Last month, the American think tank Freedom House released a report into Chinese influence operations in several countries, concluding that internal populist attacks on the media undermine its resilience and its ability to cope with external influence with transparency and effectiveness. And I think that's a very important point when we look back at the Indian examples I gave before, because those pressures do lead to mass media kind of trimming their sails. You know, a bit of self-censorship comes into play. That leads to the public losing faith in the press, and that only helps the powerful, wherever they may be. That Freedom House report called on politicians to stop targeting journalists in their own countries for political gains, saying that it weakens civil society and institutions of governance in the long run. And now, this is just a really recent example from my ABC colleague in Port Moresby, and it's a very small kind of, peripheral case of a female journalist who was attacked and harassed by supporters of a former MP outside a court case. So, very marginal, but this stuff happens often, all the time, and we never hear about it because it's mostly perpetrated against local journalists. At the other end of the spectrum, this is a very good meme explaining how far other leaders go to put pressure on the press. So the deliberate manipulation or degradation of public will and political will can lessen a population's ability to cohesively resist foreign influence. Social disintegration and disharmony and the erosion of faith in institutions like the press can be whipped up quite easily, and it has grave consequences, even in democracies, and probably the best example of that is what we've seen recently in the US. John Lee, who's a former advisor to a previous Australian Foreign Affairs Minister, said in an article in The Australian a few days ago, and it's worth reading, China designs its political warfare to shape the thinking of the target government and society, including the deliberate creation or exploitation of division within the country. And he cited Solomon Islands as a recent example. And of course, none of this is new. In the lead up to the American Revolution, many of the founding fathers used multiple pen names to whip up anti-British fervour among the public. And Napoleon, he used to write his own gazettes so that he would address his audiences and his opponents directly. But if populations are to have a right to question the kind of financial or security and political deals being struck by their governments, like in Solomon Islands, they need a strong, resilient, well-trained press to do that. When the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi recently had a state visit to Solomons, the national newspaper ran his line without question. And Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare recently directed the national broadcaster not to run any anti-government stories. So this is what's referred to in the realm of information warfare as cognitive capture, or, as Sun Tzu might have said, winning a war without fighting. As an aside, there's an excellent report on Chinese influence operations released by ASPI yesterday, and it paints a picture of the way, in great detail, that Chinese elements influence the press, editorials and press releases that get run in the local papers, which has greater traction with local populations than, say, the state-run media that China operates. It is important to note, though, that there were more articles from Australian, New Zealand and American think tanks published and republished in those local papers. So traditional media is just this really contested space at the moment, even more so in places where internet penetration is still quite low. There was also a Facebook page set up in the aftermath of the Honiara riots that gained local followers quickly and then amplified that state media material. Now, those kind of efforts work really fast and they can be retailored and re-engineered and retargeted quite easily. You know, shut down one page, open up another 5. And again, that was a really, really effective method for the Russian influence operations that we saw before and during the Trump era. But social media manipulation and disinformation really points to how important media literacy is in this landscape. That is, empowering media consumers to critically assess where their information is coming from on all sides of the debate. It's not about replacing one set of narratives with another. It's about making sure that people have the tools to access and interrogate all narratives. So let's look forward. What can we expect? Or in one of my favourite Indian English phrases, what to do? When the US began negotiating a peace deal and withdrawal with the Taliban, US General John Nicholson said that both parties were fighting and talking. And that's what the next few years will look like as the tussle for influence in the Indo-Pacific ramps up. And if we're to believe that it's right for the West to want to maintain influence or at the very least provide a counterbalance to the influence of other malign actors in our region, then there are steps that need to be taken. Australia and the US and many other nations are really scrambling to reinvigorate the institutions of civil society in our region through funding and partnerships, media training and exchanges, making up for a lack of attention given to our region over the last 20 years when all eyes were focused on the Middle East. The Cook Islands Prime Minister recently said at the Pacific Summit that was hosted by US President Biden, the Americans had acknowledged that they'd left a vacuum in the region that had been filled by other players. So there's catching up to do, and whether it's a case of too little, too late, remains to be seen. But there are also things we can do as individuals in this space, supporting civil society groups and media workers in our neighbourhood, amplifying the voices of those who are advocating for transparency and accountability, following, retweeting, engaging and encouraging, and supporting that media literacy. International silence and apathy creates space for states to carry out things like the so-called anti-terrorism raids against journalists and other civil society players. And when it comes to a free and open Indo-Pacific, that much touted phrase, a free press is a critical bulwark against forces that seek to stymie that freedom, plurality, transparency and openness.
Siobhan, thank you. That was absolutely wonderful, and I can't think of I haven't heard a stronger argument in quite a while for keeping the public square free, well-informed, engaged, and literate indeed as well. Now we've got the normal amount of time now for questions and so on. Please, if you could identify yourself before asking the question, and please ask a question rather than making a statement if you could, please. And Megan, there's a microphone. So who would like to start?
I've covered everything then.
Siobhan, I'm going to kick off because I'm an India person and I'm sort of unabashedly interested in India and engaged in India, and I'm also going to India in a week after too long away. The Indian media issue, it is on the one hand extraordinarily vibrant and on the other hand controlled, as you say, by these extremely draconian authoritarian laws which are actually put in place by the British, but of course their utility has been understood well by governments after the British left as well. How can we possibly persuade the political elite in India, including people like Modi, who, as you rightly say, has not given a press conference in 8 years, how can we possibly persuade them that a freer media in India is in India's interests?
Gosh, for a man who doesn't answer, or his entire department doesn't answer emails and questions, he doesn't seem particularly open to guidance on the matter. And look, he's had a he's had a very successful tenure as leader for 8 years now. And he has stoked, quite a bit of social division. So it's been an effective, you might say, mistreatment or control of the media. And I think the biggest or the best comparison to draw is with America. There was a lot of backslapping and glad-handing between Trump and Modi. I think they kind of admire each other and watch each other's tactics. So the only way that other nations and individuals can have an impact there is basically to engage directly with civil society groups, and there are, India's not as susceptible or as open to the kind of, the influence of the American transparency organisations and funding and training that are being propagated throughout the region. But I really do think that there is a power in amplification, There are a lot of mainstream media outlets, particularly the TV stations, which are, absolutely cacophonous, and the newspapers, which, everyone reads newspapers in India, which is amazing to see. But the newspapers will quite astutely suck up any drops, any leaks from the government, because by the time Indians read the newspapers, it's a very connected society, and so everyone's already read WhatsApp and Facebook and gone through the news, so they want whatever exclusives they can get, so they'll run any kind of, pro-government press releases or leaks that they get. But there is this resurgence of, mostly in the digital space, organisations like The Wire, Caravan magazine, which are wonderful reads for an outsider as well. They're tailored for a local audience, but you really do get a feel of the flavour of Indian society and politics, particularly through the Caravan magazine. And I do believe that they were recently subjected to some sedition charges, some of their journalists. So, to be able to support those organisations and amplify their works is probably one of the best things that we can do as individuals in order to kind of just change the tide. And of course, tides always change, as Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, said, what's the biggest challenge to any government? Events, dear boy, events. Things will change, things will happen. And we've seen that with the Trump era. Things move in cyclical patterns, and it won't be that way forever. And I hope that all those brave Indian journalists can kind of, resume the wonderful work that they've done for decades.
Wonderful, thank you. At the back there, yes. Yes, we've got a microphone. Unfortunately, you can't hold it. It'll have to be held in front of you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to question you about what role you think what the loss has been of long-form journalism against this front-foot rapid journalism that we're talking about, where you say, right, you're out, you're bad. I mean, what would be the value of taking a longer look at long-form journalism and how that has vanished from the stage to the point where you've got an entire population, for example, in the Philippines, who forget via Duterte what the Marcos regime has done. History is being lost as a result.
And a very young population in Philippines. There is, and the name of the outlet escapes me, but there's a fantastic news organisation whose journalists have been detained, but they've also won Nobel Prizes, I think, for their work. Sorry? Rappler, that's the one, yeah, Rappler. So, the brave ones still stand. And, there was a journalist in Bangladesh who was detained and tortured when he reported on the Prime Minister's, some recent reforms. And it really is amazing from an Australian perspective to think that people put their lives and their bodies on the line to do the work. But in terms of investigative journalism, that is a very highly skilled, niche kind of element of the profession. You're right that in every country, including Australia, that has taken a back seat, mostly due to the shifting business models, reduced funding. Investigative journalism costs a lot of money. But interestingly, the American Indo-Pacific strategy that I think was rewritten last year, which is a very broad-ranging look at, kind of geopolitical priorities in the region, has explicitly said that supporting investigative journalism is one of the key things that they will do in Pacific and Asian nations to kind of, build up that reservoir of interrogative journalism. So at least there's a recognition from the politicians, no less, right? From Western politicians that investigative journalism can help in this situation. And so there are plans afoot to fund organisations and training for journalists in countries where there isn't a strong tradition of interrogating leaders and following the financial trails behind, environmental and political and military deals. So you're absolutely right that that's a critical part of the equation. And there are people in positions of power around the world that are very keen to exploit that and encourage that as a way to address really just the lack of deep reporting.
Just at the back, and then I'll come to you at the front. So at the back there.
Thank you very much. My name is Lucas. I'm from Griffith University, a PhD candidate, and I'm a trained sinologist. I was wondering, during your many and impressive travels and talking to people, what was your impression what the people in the street actually think about China? Because in my research, which was specifically on India and China, it was very clear that while enthusiasm among the political elites for business is very big, the common population is really not convinced, and they're like very skeptical towards this kind of Chinese influence. So did you encounter any countries where the general population was really like, wow, the Chinese influence, the infrastructure or whatever, it's very, very beneficial and we really trust these guys? Or is it really just superficial and the soft power influence remains very low?
In India specifically, there's not much trust of China on High Street and in the villages because, they've had a border conflict. There were Indian soldiers killed a few years ago in a clash in the Himalayas. So, and India having a very strong kind of nationalist fervour, I guess, in the population, they don't, give China much trust. In other countries where China has been welcomed in with open arms to build those kind of infrastructure projects, places like Sri Lanka where they're building airports and deepening, ports, and especially in Pakistan where, that's a key kind of fulcrum in the Belt and Road Initiative, China's made a few cultural missteps, right, that has really got the local population offside. There was a terrible case of, because China often imports its own workforce when it builds these projects. And for instance, there were, this is in a very conservative country, of course, an incident where road workers were using local prostitutes, and that ended up, there were fisticuffs between the local male population and these Chinese workers, and I think a few were murdered. There have also been terrorist attacks that have killed Chinese workers in some locations. So there's a bit of frustration that perhaps the local populations aren't benefiting directly with employment and economic growth the way that they were told by their leaders that they would be. And I mean, Sri Lanka is a great example at the moment because we've seen, economic turmoil, which not entirely, corruption is a problem as well, but, the Chinese kind of debt traps, as they're kind of glibly referred to, have caused problems in Sri Lanka. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but I also did a story in East Africa about the Chinese influence, and they do employ mostly Chinese workers, but there's a lot of local employment in places like Zambia, Kenya, where there is not much choice for local labourers, for low-skilled workers. And so in other parts of the world, there's a bit more openness, because at the end of the day, people want bread, they want chicken in the fridge. And those kind of short-term needs can really dictate the responses as well.
Got a gentleman at the front, and then I'll come back to you in the next question.
Do you think that this move to control journalists and control a narrative reflects a change from nationalist leaders to narcissistic leaders, so that anyone who criticizes anything that the government does is taken to be a personal criticism of leaders who frankly are almost psychopathic?
I'm just trying to think. We've never seen anything like that in Australia, have we? That's universal, right? And in different countries, people have different politicians, and the elite have different mechanisms to deal with that, right? Power, when it becomes entrenched for a long time with a particular party or a particular leader, you do get this cult of personality, and absolutely that's a factor in Modi's rule. But it's about a desire to cling to power, and the press they become the enemy. Well, as Trump said, the enemy of the people, right? But it's when you can enable your populations, your voting blocks to believe that we're in deep trouble. And once again, I circle back to the importance of media literacy and the strength of other civil society organisations, and the press upholding their end of the bargain, and pushing through some really horrific pressures to be able to do their job in a way that maintains public trust and faith. And it is, it's a really high stakes game for journalists in a lot of these countries.
Sorry, I'm going to give you lots of exercise. There's a lady up there. We can train our students well,
Yeah,
physically and
of course.
Sorry. Helen Wedlake. I've worked in agribusiness in areas that are controversial. Whistleblowers, it actually takes a lot to bring out issues, and then it comes to the journalist when they're put under pressure to reveal their sources, which would have repercussions on the people or a body that are desperate to get their story out. How do the journalists actually deal with the pressure of having to reveal sources? And I think this has happened in Australia, where we've put journalists under that type of pressure.
All the time. You get some interesting phone calls, sometimes 10 minutes to deadline. So in Australia, we have a pretty strong culture of not revealing sources. So it's written in the Media Code of Ethics. And I've yet to meet a journalist who will reveal a source. People are quite willing to go to jail rather than do that, because it undermines the effectiveness of the whole profession. And the whistleblower laws, protection laws, need to be strengthened in this country as well, so that they're protected. Things like Witness X and the Bernard Collaery case, underscore the fact that that's not watertight. But in other countries, this case in Bangladesh that I mentioned, where this man was, hog-tied and tortured for months on end, taken from his apartment by police in the middle of the night. To withstand that kind of terrifying pressure, the threat against your life, I can't even imagine. I've never been in that position where, you might have to choose between, being tortured and giving up your source. And in many cases, they don't. And that's a real testament to the remarkable bravery and commitment of journalists like the Rappler editors and writers as well. So, the strength and commitment of journalists where they are really invested in the ethics of the trade is pretty damn impressive.
A question down the front. Please. From the old boss and the new boss.
Thank you, that's scary. Thanks, Siobhan, this has been really interesting. In the contest for influence, I guess, investing in narrative is really important. You alluded to the fact that Australia's investments in the instruments of narrative, particularly ABC International, have declined over the years. What would you like to see Australia doing, particularly as we engage more actively in the region?
Well, it comes as no surprise for me to say that it was a great mistake to shut down those international offerings. And the Australian network wasn't just ABC content. They showed Neighbours, they showed the AFL Grand Final, right? So it really was kind of sharing a whole range of cultural, products. I'm sure it was just expats watching the AFL Grand Final, but still it was there, to confuse other populations. There has been a recognition of late that is critical soft diplomacy, and so there are moves afoot to re-establish a presence in the Asia-Pacific. Case of, it is a bit of too little too late, because we've lost shortwave radio channels and the like. But I think that, in an increasingly media literate, digitally kind of focused world, I think it's just important to empower people to do their own journalism as well, and I think that by hitting that grassroots edge and offering training, teaching people how to ask questions, in some places people just don't interrogate leaders at press conferences at all. So to be able to exchange that kind of knowledge and education and training, I think, is a bit more of a modern and a long-lasting effect. Retaining journalists in places in the Pacific and Asia can be really difficult because it's not well paid. It's not always well respected, particularly when you're being labelled prostitutes, for instance, right? There are much easier ways to make money, and to earn a living. So I think enabling the journalists in their own countries, to fill those gaps and to do that really important work themselves, with their own cultural backgrounds for people in their countries is probably more important at this stage. And that strengthening of all the other affiliated civil society organisations is part of that drive as well, which the US and Australia is very well aware of the need to do that. So we're seeing a lot of investment, and like I say, it's a contested space and will remain so for a long time.
I've got something else I want to ask you about as well, and it's something that other people who've been posted in South Asia have said to me, which is the challenge of getting onto the news at 7 o'clock in the evening, and the kinds of stories that you can tell and the ones that don't necessarily appeal. Do you have any kind of reflections on that challenge? But have you seen over the time that you've been a journalist a different kind of interest in the Australian audience for the kinds of stories that we see coming out of this, hugely diverse region?
Well, audiences are always changing and they're becoming increasingly fractured, and the poor old ABC is trying to deal with that by doing video on demand and YouTube and digital media and TikTok and all the rest. Different people want different things, even in the Australian audience. We don't all sit down at 7 p.m. anymore to watch the bulletin as curated by an extremely experienced executive producer and read by an authoritative newsreader. A lot of people just get their news off Facebook. So there are challenges there. But I think it's always been a struggle, and I was posted to India during the Trump administration, and all of us in Bangkok and Port Moresby and Jerusalem and India and Nairobi would kind of have these phone calls, after he'd tweeted. We'd just say, yep, you got a book you're going to read this week? Yeah, thought I might just, go up into the hills and see if I can find a story in X or Y town, because the space to get stories out there is really shrinking. COVID was even worse than Trump because it just sucked all the airspace, the airtime, the bulletin inches away from all these other stories. When I wanted to go to Afghanistan, when the peace deals were being negotiated and the first ceasefires were being initiated. We always joke as journalists, it's a battle to convince the Australian military to let us, inside to report. That's a cultural kind of thing in defence. But I was also having battles with my editors as to why that story needed to be told. And I remember someone saying to me on the phone, "Oh, do we still have troops in Afghanistan? Oh, is that war still going?" There are stories that come from the Washington and the London bureau, the Queen dying, significant, but those stories just suck the space away from all the other ones. So yeah, it can be a real struggle, and for journalists who are passionate about certain countries, and most of the correspondents have chosen their regions because they're engaged and well-travelled there, and they're passionate about what's going on in those places. We do kind of have to take the fight to our editors just as much as we then have to take the fight to, whatever government department or source we're trying to wrangle to help us tell the story. So it works both ways. I guess there's a lot of niche media and reporting that people can access, but certainly the mainstream news is becoming a little bit more restricted in what it wants to fit and can fit. Which is why forums like this are so important, and things like the Asia-Pacific Triennial, the art show that, opens up all these perspectives, gives voice to marginalised groups and people, and, as a journalist, I'm absolutely committed to doing that. But the engagement, I think it has to be more broad than it is.
Thank you. I think we've probably got time for one more question, one more answer. Gentleman there in the right shirt.
Hi, Neil Ruskin. I'm just wondering, in recent years, ABC has really taken a lot of journalists from the international sort of stage, but also bolstered the regional part of Australia, where you'd have a couple of journalists in a small country town. Is the ABC business model in line with what the government wants to sort of be an influence internationally, and rather than sort of the Australian sort of public?
There's a lot spoken about funding cuts that come from the government budgets, the triennial funding, and yes, that's had an impact on what we can do. But the individual decisions that are made about where to cut programs, is made internally in the organisation. So in 2015, they decided to remove the cameraman and some senior producers from a lot of those overseas bureaus in favour of video journalists. So I had to learn to, film and edit my own stories and run around with tripods and cameras and take my own photographs and file for digital, radio, online TV and do live crosses myself. There's definitely been a reduction in the resources available to do the job and do the job well. But it's something that's affecting the whole industry, the Sydney Morning Herald, or the Fairfax papers, now 9, and the Australian, pulled people out of all sorts of overseas bureaus in recent years. I think the Australian sent someone back to Washington after Trump was elected because, they realised, there's a few stories here. Yeah, Cameron Stewart went back, that's right. So it's not unique to the ABC. There's just been this decline in interest in reporting from foreign countries. But again, events, dear boy, events. Nobody had a bunch of journalists in the Pacific Islands until a few months ago, and now every journalist in Australia and the region is heading there for every horse and pony show that occurs, every summit, every meeting. So these things are kind of cyclical again, and what's out of fashion or flavour one week might be very important again in a few years. Of course, we had to shut down our Beijing bureau because we were kicked out, along with a lot of other foreign reporters. I think the BBC, who's an ex-ABC correspondent, Stephen McDonnell, I don't know, what his secret sauce is, but they haven't kicked him out yet, and God bless that man, because he's a fantastic reporter.
He certainly is. I would like to thank you, but it's not my job. So I'd like to call on Mr. Simon Elliott, who's the Deputy Director here at the Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art, to give the vote of thanks. Simon.
Take a seat.
Okay.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Siobhan. What a fantastic talk. We are so lucky in a country such as Australia to be able to have such a robust conversation about the Fourth Estate. And as Ian said, I'm Simon Elliott. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Queensland Art Gallery, and we love working with Griffith University and the Asia Institute to bring us such thoughtful and insightful conversations. Siobhan actually chose the topic, the pen and the sword, clearly avoiding the topic, which is the pen is greater than the sword. So she didn't say that it was. But Siobhan and I have actually known each other for a long time. When I was in Canberra, she was a cadet at the ABC, and it's wonderful to see her back here. But what's kind of interesting, and I want to just turn the camera onto Siobhan herself, because she didn't, except a couple of pictures up there. So going from Canberra, we all know Canberra is just the most beautiful city, and it's very gentle and very lovely at a certain level. It can be a bit robust and nasty up at the hill, but Siobhan was always there covering the arts and always very attentive and very knowledgeable and really interested in telling stories and, revealing the truth, etc. But I watched her, as many of us did, go to some of the most difficult places I could well imagine in the world to report back to Australia what is happening there. So as you read, she's been to India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nepal, East Africa. These are dangerous places. She's covered, as you saw, earthquakes, wars, all sorts of really conflict-filled events that she's then got to process, see, watch, witness, process, and then regurgitate or translate back to us. And Siobhan talks about the dangers that she has seen. So clearly being in an earthquake under a table is a dangerous place to be. When you're watching other journalists be trapped by the police or taken away or disappear, to be killed, to be murdered, these are incredibly risky things for a profession. Now, I'm in a profession, and it's a million miles away from the danger that I face in my workplace, apart from a few staff members. But we take that for granted, that people are literally putting their lives on the line to tell us the true stories or the real stories. That is incredible bravery from Siobhan, and I just want to acknowledge that, which kind of was the subtext there. But it's Siobhan and her journalist friends and colleagues who are actually trying to tell the truth and keep power, somehow in some kind of, being accountable. Can I give a round of applause for that? And in just saying that, Siobhan was a bit perplexed by Modi's dislike of journalists. Some of us remember Joh Bjelke-Petersen, who referred to feeding the chooks. It was his idea of journalism at the disrespectful height of it. But look, you've covered war and politics and media, China, India. Siobhan, it's incredible insight. You've given a personal insight to that whole world. But I think fundamentally what you've said is how important the press and the media is to a well-functioning democracy. And in a time when we have more information than probably any time in the whole of humankind, which is all fractured and crazy and wrong and nuts, it is absolutely right to seek that kind of literacy that kind of works through that minefield of rubbish that we often see. And, places like the ABC I personally think I don't know what we'd be like in Australia without the ABC, and it's constantly under threat, as culture is under threat, sometimes in government funding models, etc. But thank goodness for journalism, thank goodness for the media, and thanks so much, Siobhan, for what you've done in your long and exciting career. Thank you for being here. And thank you for loving the Asia Pacific Triennial. We'll pay you for that later on.